Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be about law school application essays, including the personal statement and supplemental essays. I will not be reading any of my essays word for word, but I will be sharing what I wrote about and how I brainstormed, edited, and planned my essays that got me into Columbia Law as a splitter. I don't think that there's necessarily a single correct way to go about writing these essays. Different things work for different people, but I thought I'd just share my process and any tips that I've learned from my experience. Quick disclaimer, I'm not an expert or an admissions consultant or anything. I'm just someone who got into a law school and wants to share her experience. So first, what are the essay components in a law school application? So the main essay is called the personal statement. Each school may have a slightly different personal statement prompt, and some schools might even give you multiple prompts to choose from. But generally, a personal statement is 2 to 3 pages long, and it's a chance to tell the admissions team a story about who you are or why you want to go to law school. Usually, the personal statement prompts are pretty broad. So it's really your chance to speak to the admissions team directly and tell them something that they won't be able to find in the rest of your application. And then you have these supplemental statements. Some schools require them and others have optional supplementals, but usually the supplementals are around 1 page long or even shorter, and they can really cover a variety of topics depending on the school. A lot of schools have required or optional diversity statements, which has recently changed into kind of a more broader prompt that allows you to share something unique about your background or how you might contribute to the diversity at a school. Another popular supplemental essay topic is the why school essay, where you get a chance to show your specific interest in a school. And then there are also other more fun random prompts, like if you could have dinner with anyone living or dead, who would it be and why? Or tell us about a time when you changed your mind about something. But generally, all law school essay prompts follow very generally the same vein of topics, which is like sharing about yourself and your interest in law, what makes you unique, and stuff like that. My biggest tip for essays in general is to be genuine, because all of these essays are ultimately meant to show the admissions team something unique about you, and the best way to do that is to connect with them through your genuine emotions and experiences. So first, for timeline. Schools release each of their specific prompts at the beginning of each admission cycle in September, but like I said in my previous law school application video, the topics usually don't change much year to year, so what I did was I started preparing my essays a few months before September so that when the actual prompts are released, I didn't have to start from scratch. Now, I did this because law school admissions happen on a rolling basis and I wanted to get a head start, but if you're not able to get a head start, I think it's also fine to just start in September after you see the official prompts, because you technically have until the beginning of the next year to submit. And just to recap quickly from my other video, the general timeline that I followed was I started really getting into essay prep in July because I finished my LSAT in June, and then I spent the majority of July and all of August just writing drafts, rewriting, and editing. Then in September, when the prompts were released, was when I really hammered down on editing and even writing some new essays based on any new questions that they released. Then in October, I worked on my final drafts and final reviews and then submitted. I know that that might seem like a very early or rushed timeline for a lot of people, but for me personally, I had a lot of time to spend on this over the summer, so it also just depends on how much time you have to devote to this. So first, we need to start brainstorming. Some important tips for the brainstorming process are to get creative, but stay genuine. I think that these were actually the 2 main takeaways that I learned from all of the law school info sessions that I've attended. Admissions officers obviously want a memorable and unique story, but they also want to know about how you felt or what you've learned as you experienced that story. So give yourself free range. Don't limit yourself to just professional settings or just academic settings. I definitely struggled with this a lot because it's easy to think like my life isn't that special or exciting, but I actually found that it's more about how you tell the story rather than what you're actually writing about. So really take your time to think about what makes you happy or angry or your favorite childhood snack, because even something as simple or as random as that can turn into a really unique story about your personality or your personal growth. So I had a 7Sage subscription for a while I was studying for the LSAT. 7Sage has a lot of great example essays, and I'm sure that you could just look up example essays online, but reading through some examples really shows you just how wide the range of topics can be for personal statements. So for me, some of the first kind of more obvious ideas that came to mind were my work experience, my background living in different countries, and some of my hobbies. But then some of the not so obvious ideas that required a little bit of more self-reflection or jogging my memory were things like why I started keeping a journal, a bad injury that I had, anxiety, or a childhood dream that I had forgotten about. So I had all of these things written down in a list, but I didn't really know which one to start with or what to do with them. Taking the time to understand my overall application strengths and weaknesses actually helped guide me when I was deciding what topics to use for the different prompts. So what I mean by that is, I have no law background. I've never interned in a law-related field or taken a legal course even, and I have a few years of work experience in a completely unrelated field. So I could see that there may be some gaps in my application that might leave the admissions team with some questions, the main ones being, why am I switching into law school and why am I doing that now? So I knew that I wanted to use my personal statement to kind of answer those questions by emphasizing my intellectual or academic curiosity about law and by clearly showing how my past experiences or my background have led me into law school. So with that in mind, at this stage, I narrowed down my personal statement topics to two options. One was about an experience that I had at work and how it kind of stimulated my intellectual curiosity and ultimately led me to apply to law school. And then the other option was about how keeping a journal kind of helped my mental and emotional growth, which then led me to apply to law school. And then that left me with a long list of all the other ideas that I had written down, which I saved for the supplemental essay prompts. So I hope that kind of makes sense as to how kind of stepping back and trying to look at your overall application from the perspective of the admissions team may be able to help you sort out your thoughts while brainstorming. Now here comes the really hard part, which is cutting off brainstorming and actually starting to write. I would spend hours and hours and hours sitting at a cafe on the weekend just trying to reflect on everything that's ever happened to me in my life and trying to make it into a story. But at some point I had to just choose a few of my best ideas that I kept coming back to and just start writing or at least outlining a rough beginning, middle, and end. This was also difficult for me because I kept second guessing myself and I got attached to certain ideas that I thought might make me look good or that I thought were particularly fun stories to tell. Taking time away helps, and I mean that in two different senses. So one, literally taking time away from your computer. I know it might feel like you're wasting time, but I actually found that I got inspired by living my actual real life and not thinking about my essays for once. And two, even just taking a break from your personal statement specifically and maybe looking at some of the shorter supplemental prompts could help relieve some pressure or change things up. I found that the personal statement was kind of the longest and the heaviest story. So sometimes if I was only working on that every day for a week, by the end of the week, I felt like it was actually easier to turn to the supplemental prompts because I found that they were a little bit lighter, shorter, and easier to write freely. So ultimately, after brainstorming and doing some outlines, for my personal statement, I decided to write about the experience at work that inspired me to go to law school. And I kept second guessing this one because I didn't really want to just write about work again because they have my resume and they know what I did for work. But I really tried to keep the story about my thought processes and my curiosity and things that I've learned. And then for my diversity essay, I decided to write about how living in different countries shaped my perspective. And then I had kind of a generic template for my why school essays so that I could fit in all of my research that I was going to do for each school. And then I started really writing, full paragraphs, full drafts, and editing. Basically, once I had a first rough draft of my personal statement, I sent it to a few people to get their thoughts on the general flow of the story and the message that it was giving them. I didn't really ask them to check for grammar or punctuation or anything because I knew that I would probably be changing the sentences up later. But at least for these first few drafts, I just asked them if the story was interesting, if it made sense, and if it painted a good picture of me. Then as I went through my second, third, fourth revisions, I started asking new people for their thoughts to get fresh perspectives. Now, one thing about that is you might get to the point where you have so many different opinions that it gets overwhelming. And if you do feel that way, then probably at that point you've gotten enough opinions and you just need to make a decision for yourself. So I gave myself roughly 1 to 2 weeks for each draft. It's kind of hard to say because I was working on my personal statement and some of the other shorter essays at the same time. And again, I had a lot of time to devote to this over the summer, but also sometimes I would be 2 or 3 drafts into one story and then I would change my mind and decide to explore a completely different storyline. Looking back, I'm very glad that I gave myself over a month to just do drafts and revisions and more writing. Now to talk briefly about supplemental essays, I'm talking more about the optional ones because obviously if it's a required prompt, you should write it. What I did was I wrote every optional essay that I thought would add something new to my application. Optional supplementals are an amazing opportunity to show your initiative or show the admissions team yet another aspect of your personality. So I would go back to my list of ideas that I had from brainstorming, then I would take a step back and look at my overall application and see if any of those stories that I brainstormed would add something new to the picture that is my entire application. So in my case, I had already covered work experience and why I'm switching to law school in my personal statement. I covered background and diversity in my diversity statement. So for some of the other optional essays, I wrote about things like my strengths and weaknesses, fun stories about my leadership. So now we finally move on to the final reviews and submitting. Like I said, schools release their prompts in September usually, and I'll leave a link in the description for the 7Sage page where they compiled all the different essay prompts for each school for this past admission cycle. I found that page really useful for organizing what schools had what questions. So once those were released, I went back and started editing all of my existing essays and stories to better fit each school's questions. And this is when you really need to catch all of those small details like grammar, spelling, font size, margins, and headers. But it's also where you have to look big picture. Like take a look at all of the materials that each school is going to be receiving from you and make sure that everything is labeled correctly and organized and that each school is going to be receiving a cohesive story from you. My final tip for submitting your essays would be to take your time. You put in all of this hard work and all of these drafts, so you don't want to rush the ending and make a silly mistake like labeling something wrong or uploading the wrong file. So that's about it for this video. I hope that it was helpful, and I will make a video about LSAT studying tips, but I want to make sure that I'm remembering everything correctly from my experience. I also want to put together an organized and efficient video, so I'm taking my time with that. Thanks for watching.